Hello, welcome to Sound and Fury Book Reviews. As usual, I am Tina. Today I am doing something a little different. I'm not talking about books today, I'm talking about movies. So, I don't get a ton of time to watch TV and movies, but in October we only watch horror, and this month we watched only 60 to 80s B movies. We usually watch a couple of those interspersed with modern horror, but this time we ended up sticking to these classics. So because I watch a lot of these movies, not just at Halloween, I figured I'd do a ranking because it's kind of fun and funny. Back to books, next week, I promise, next week I've got a sci-fi book for you for review, and I have my sci-fi bingo that I didn't do last month, so it'll be fun. This ranking goes from least favorite to favorite of these specific movies that I happen to watch this month. This list does not include my favorite ones like Exterminators of the Year 3000, Cherry 2000, even Galaxy of Terror that I really like despite that rather weird scene in the movie that I'm not going to talk about. I also really like Chud and Piranha, so those aren't on this list because I didn't watch those this month. These are movies that I have not seen before this month, and they rank from stupid garbage to I tell everyone about this now. So while the list starts off with two movies I thought were not the best, the rest, are more I love this because, and you should watch it because. So this is not like a rant movie about these movies. This is just progresses, okay? I love these campy B movies. I could do a whole video on why I like them despite some of the stuff in them that is definitely not really jarring with my despite some of the stuff that's quite dated, and anyway, so jumping right in, starting from least favorite. The least favorite movie I watched this month was Rawhead Rex from 1986. What's it about? Ireland will never be the same after Rawhead Rex, a particularly nasty demon, is released from his underground prison by an unwitting farmer. That is not the plot. That's not what happens at all. This movie is so stupid. It's the stupidest thing I think I've ever seen. Now, as I said, I love campy horror for sure. I love it. But this one was just too asinine for words. Also, a child dies, which I'm not cool with. Horror isn't as fun when that happens, at least to me. I don't know, that's just something that I particularly don't like. Anyway, the monster's outfit was absolutely terrible, and the plot is so loose and lacking in any sort of interesting backstory that it felt very sloppy. Clive Barker was involved with this movie, and he's not my favorite author by any means. I've read 3 of his books and I didn't like any of them, so that might be why. He loves to use like religious iconography or concepts, but this one was not fleshed out in any way at all. Also, the name is really dumb. There's also a very, very weird baptism scene in the movie that is probably the only noteworthy thing about it. I mean, it's not the worst movie I've ever seen in my life, but it's quite derivative, and I wasn't fond of it. So yeah, that was of all of them, that was the one I kind of was like, oh, is this thing over yet? The next one I didn't like as much was Inferno from 1980. This is about an American college student in Rome and his sister in New York investigate a series of killings in both locations where their resident addresses are the domain of 2 covens of witches. I had no idea until after I watched this that it was a sequel of sorts to Suspiria because it's by the same director. It's actually part of 3 movies that are kind of interrelated. There's really nothing to suggest this, so I'm not sure why it's considered that. Anyway, unless you're like a huge Argento fan, I don't know if this would be something that the regular person would know. Anyway, in truth, the movie is pretty boring. The plot is so back and forth, it's hard to keep track of everybody. The 2 characters, the sister and the girlfriend, are very similar, so I kept mixing them up. And there were several scenes that really pushed your suspension of disbelief, and not in the kind of fun, campy way, but more in the what kind of way. You could tell this movie was focused more on style than story, and I found it less than engaging. There were some scenes that were really interesting and fun, and, the deaths that happen are interesting as well, but it wasn't enough to hold up the kind of flimsy story. The only reason I'm ranking this less than the next one, because I think this one was actually more stylistically better, is because there's this very long and prolonged scene where a man drowns a bag of cats. I understand why it happened in the story, but it was needlessly drawn out and it made me quite upset. So, yeah, there's that. The next one is Sole Survivor from 1984, where a lone survivor of a plane crash is haunted by a feeling. A lone survivor of a plane crash is haunted by feeling unworthy of survival. Dead people start coming after her to collect her. Yeah, okay, these are like IMDb very short summaries. I'm not going to read the whole plot. So yeah, but that's basically what it's about. There's spoilers in this review because I can't talk about it without the spoilers. So, I mean, this movie is so dull, you're not missing much to skip it if you want. Just listen to my spoilers. If not, jump here to skip the spoilers. As I said, this movie was incredibly dull. Movies from the 60s to 70s that are slow, I actually tend to like, but this one felt like it went on for 900 years. There is honestly nothing memorable about this movie. The premise was hard to grasp. I kept waiting for some sort of twist, but the movie's 100% face value what it says it's about. A woman survives a plane crash, but then she's haunted by recently dead people because death is catching up to her. What does that even mean? Final Destination at least had fun deaths and made the fate concept more readily understandable. Honestly, though, without the final scene of this movie, the movie would have been a lot better. Instead, the end scene just opens up a whole slew of questions that leave the movie absolutely frustrating. I can't understand these reviews, because obviously after I watched it, I obviously go and look at other reviews. And yeah, I don't understand these like people that love this movie, because this movie freaking sucks. Nosferatu, 1979. Count Dracula moves from Transylvania to Wismar, spreading the Black Plague across the land. Only a woman pure of heart can bring an end to his reign of terror. This is the remake of the one from 1922. I know it's considered a classic, and I was into it enough, but my husband and I both fell asleep, so maybe we weren't into it that much. I'm going to try it again sometime, maybe, but there was just so much walking around in the wilderness, and Mina's role, which is quite prevalent in Dracula, of which this is a knockoff, is reduced to a sacrificial lamb symbol of purity that, in fact, drove me kind of nuts because I hate that trope. So gone are the sexual overtones, gone is the sexy vampire aspect. This is just a monster feature at this point, and in that regard, it's kind of boring because it takes a long time to kind of get going. There is a fantastic scene, though, in the castle where Dracula watches Harker eat. That scene on its own was phenomenal. If you had just been like, show me this scene, and been like, that's what the movie's about, I would have said the movie was like a 10 out of 10. But the rest of the movie around it is, it just didn't hit the mark for me. So, whatever. Cemetery of Terror, 1985. On Halloween, a group of medical students steal the corpse of a serial killer from a morgue and raise him from the dead, inadvertently putting themselves and a group of young neighborhood children in danger. They are not medical students. I don't think the movie specified that. They're basically just typical teenagers or young adults messing around in an abandoned house. So I'm going to explain kind of this. It's kind of long, but it's ridiculous. So these three guys trick their girlfriends into coming into this house that they broke into so they can presumably seduce them, of course, I guess. The girls are pissed off because the guys said they were taking them to a sweet party, which they gave up tickets to a concert to attend instead. And then they find themselves, in this crappy house with cheap booze and a clear attempt at getting in their pants. I can't remember how this comes about, but after the girls confront the boys, and the boys stupidly don't understand why the girls are so annoyed, one of the guys finds this book and decides it would be funny to do a resurrection spell from it. So to impress the girls, whom I might add are not impressed by any of this at all, they break into the morgue and steal a random dead body. They do all of this because they think it's going to get them laid. I don't understand. I mean, maybe desperate times for desperate measures, but why wouldn't they have just taken the girls to the concert? Like, that would have probably got them more riled up than this random abandoned house. Anyway, the moral of the story is that these young men are idiots. And secondly, you shouldn't steal bodies from a morgue because that is at least in US terms, I'm assuming that's like a federal crime. I don't really know. It seems like something you probably shouldn't do. Especially don't steal the body of a serial killer and then resurrect him. Because what happens is they do the ritual, the serial killer guy comes back from the dead along with a bunch of zombies. There's a bunch of ridiculous death scenes, some very long chase scenes, and a grizzled cop teaming up with a psychiatrist that honestly added very little to the plot. It's entertaining, but I would not call this movie a hidden gem. It's a bit too slow and a bit too stupid. Intruder. So I forgot to get the synopsis of this one, but basically it's a bunch of people that work in like a grocery store overnight and they get terrorized by some person. So It's a slasher film, clearly. So Bruce Campbell has a cameo in this, which is why it's better than Cemetery of Terror. Also, the characters are far more likable, and the movie has tension, though less about the murders and more about a woman's violent ex-boyfriend. That tension was very well done. There are also some really interesting camera angles that sometimes were really immersive and others that didn't really work, but it was like really fun to watch. And Sam Raimi was in the movie, but it's clearly kind of his style, so obviously the director and him, I'm guessing they like went to film school or something together because it felt like a Sam Raimi movie even though he wasn't directing it. Also, it feels like the characters actually work in a retail store. Unlike some big name movies where it's clear that nobody has ever worked in retail ever, this one felt like authentic, and I liked that part of it. But to be honest, the reason this movie's kind of in the middle of the pack for me is that the plot of the movie is very lackluster and easy to guess. From pretty much the start, I knew what was going to happen, though obviously not the specifics of like the specifics. I don't want to spoil anything. I'm also not a huge slasher fan. I find them a bit tedious. I much prefer like a creature feature. I mean, I guess slashers and creature features are kind of the same because it's people like running away from something chasing them. But for some reason, I find creatures more interesting than like just like I'm not a huge fan of like Halloween or Michael Myers, anything like that. So yeah, I don't mind Jason, but yeah, I don't know. Actually, no, Jason X, that was the best. Anyway, this is definitely a slasher, and it has some interesting deaths in it, and I liked the characters. I liked Intruder. It was good. Messiah of Evil, 1973. A young woman goes searching for her missing artist father. Her journey takes her to a strange Californian seaside town governed by a mysterious undead cult. I liked the artsy aspects of this movie, but the story is very slow and stilted, with characters that don't seem to have any real motivations. There are some interesting things about this movie to be sure, like a scene in a movie theater and the prologue and epilogue, but there are things about it that don't make sense, like a main character letting some randoms just live in her dad's house. Maybe that's the 70s things though. And there's some inconsistency in the undead symptoms people start to experience and then the pacing. But overall, I was more engaged with it than I was with Intruder, but for a different reason. And in fact, I would say that those two are kind of on the same level in terms of like in my ranking, because they're completely different movies with different kind of purpose to them. This one's definitely more artsy. The Intruder's definitely more kind of campy and fun. So yeah, I did like Messiah of Evil. The Dead Pit, 1989. A renegade doctor is shot dead and entombed with his fiendish experiments in the basement of an abandoned wing of a mental hospital. I overall liked this more than Intruder and Messiah of Evil, but it's very slow. It turns into a slasher halfway through that goes on forever. It's just this woman screaming and running around an abandoned mental institution for like 20 minutes. It's very tedious. But then it turns into a zombie movie and it got really good again. So it's like has a really interesting start, a really shitty middle, and then a great ending. It's kind of all over the place. It does have this hilarious scene, though, which is why I'm ranking it so high. So this woman is tied up, and she's wearing a white shirt, and some crazy nurse woman comes in and starts spraying her with a hose, and her shirt just disintegrates somehow, and out come her boobs. It's amazingly funny, and I couldn't take it. I laughed so hard. I'm pretty sure my husband and I rewound it and watched it again and just like laughed the whole time, the entire time. And I wasn't even under the influence of anything, which I usually am when I'm watching these movies. I prefer the certain drinks that you can buy at certain stores around here. Yeah, so, but this one I was actually fully sober for, and I still laughed quite a bit. So we also have the main character running around in underwear that they would not give you in a mental institution, and she wore it all the time. It was just so blatantly objectifying. I was just like, I can't take it. It was just like, it was so bad that it was funny. The ending was actually awesome in that a shitty motel house was used in the climax, and I love when little models are used for stuff, but it was very predictable. Nothing about the movie is noteworthy except for the hose scene, which is hilarious. I'm talking about this movie a lot though because I did actually like it. It's just like it's not that great though. I don't know why. The acting is abysmal in the movie though. The acting is wretched. Anyway. Bay of Blood, 1971. When elderly Countess Frederica is murdered at her isolated mansion, a gruesome battle ensues to ensure the rights to her valuable property around the bay. This one started off really strong, got really slow, then went to 11 with its twists. The movie is fantastic. It has the typical nonsense of these movies, sex-crazed teenagers, not only a boobs out scene, but a full naked scene. I was like, whoa. As well as a bit too much scenic panning of both the naked woman swimming and the landscape. But the last half of the movie is so intricately plotted that I had no idea what was going on, but in a really good way. I kept having to pause and be like, okay, wait, so this guy is trying to get this guy, but this woman is trying to kill this man. The characters are all trying to backstab, murder one another in different ways, and the action horror elements of that part are so good. The ending, it felt like they didn't know how to end it and just made something up on the spot, but the lead up and the twists and stuff were so good. It also includes one of the most physically impossible and bonkers deaths I've ever seen on screen. I laughed so hard. Honestly, I just... It was the stupidest death scene, but it was so funny. What's next? I got three more for you here. City of the Dead from 1960. A young college student arrives in sleepy Massachusetts town to research witchcraft. During her stay at an eerie inn, she discovers a startling secret about the town and its inhabitants. I loved this. I absolutely loved this. We have a woman main character who takes charge, a rather predictable story that still manages to be delightfully fun, and a precursor to the tits out scene that was surprising in its suddenness, and also in the how in the world was she comfortable wearing all that lingerie under her regular clothes all the time? I love old black and white movies, and this was one of them. Despite how slow they are, I would argue actually that this one was quite fast for the time period. It moved quite quickly, and it's just a charming movie. It also has Christopher Lee in it. I highly recommend City of the Dead. Hell Night, 1981. 4 college pledges are forced to spend the night in a deserted old mansion where they are stalked by the monstrous survivor of a family massacre years earlier. In truth, I will say I was not expecting to like this one at all, so I was pleasantly surprised when it was so much fun. You can tell it had a slightly higher budget than some of the other B movies, which maybe made it a bit better. I liked the characters. The 4 fit the typical archetypes we see in this kind of movie thing, but with a bit more depth to them. I actually kind of liked them. Usually you're like, oh, the throwaway teenagers who get murdered, who cares? But I was kind of like, oh, I like these kids. Now, the movie was not scary, but the premise and the fact that we have someone actually leave the house to get help, which you never ever see, was so fun and interesting. Linda Blair was in it too, which was kind of interesting too. The only real problem with the movie was that it's predicated upon this extreme form of ableism, and there's lots of slurs dropped towards mental illness and people with disabilities. So I would definitely not a movie you could make today, and definitely a movie we shouldn't make today. But from 1981, as a campy movie, as a product of its time, it's hard to say I permit this, but it's hard to get away from this in that time period. So, okay. Anyway, it was an enjoyable movie if you ignore that aspect of it. Now, my favorite movie, which I mentioned actually when I reviewed the book Pulse the other day, and this is The Deadly Spawn from 1983. I love this movie. I love it. It's probably it's moving into my top 5 favorite old campy B movies. So, what's it about? When a meteorist touches down in the New Jersey woods carrying a monstrous alien slug, it's up to 4 teens to stop it before its terrifying brood consumes all life on Earth. It has this opening scene that is so shitty. It's the shittiest opening I've ever seen in my life, and I laughed so hard. It was so bad. The gore factor in this movie too was also through the roof, including a scene we watched twice because it was so mind-bafflingly over the top and made absolutely no sense, but it was so funny. It's one of those movies that if the special effects hadn't been campy or hadn't been animatronic, it probably would have been horrific. It would have been disturbingly gory. But because the special effects were so bad and the things were clearly dummies, it was so funny. The plot was also fun. The characters are interesting in that they have real personalities, and I liked the women characters, though of course this nerdy smart one dies and the sexy blonde lives, but that was the time. The animatronics are great, actually, in terms of, like, so they're not scary because they're animatronic, but they're really well done. The little baby spawns are so cute. And the movie moves at a fantastic pace. I really liked it. It's an ultimate creature feature, and I highly recommend you try it, despite the really crappy starting. Also, and I thought this was kind of interesting, the obligatory tits out scene featured an older woman, which was surprising to me, and different, and it was different from the usual kind of titty teasers, of which every movie in this list, except for Nosferatu and Intruder, surprisingly, had. Even Soul Survivor somehow had one. But, you know, this is a trope, and one that, while I find it exploitative, I also find it funny. I could do a whole video on the tits out B-movie horror trope, but I'd probably get the wrong type of viewers, so I will not. Overall, I have to say, though, if you have to watch 3 campy B-horror movies, watch The Deadly Spawn, check out Hell Night, and check out City of the Dead and Bay of Blood. All 4 of those are great. Yeah, and they're all very different. So there you go. Thanks for watching. Let me know what your favorite mid to late 20th century Boo movie is, because I need some more to watch. Do not send me slashers, though. I'm not super into slashers. Creature features, please. Please. And we'll see if I've seen them, because I have actually seen quite a few. Yeah, so thanks for watching.